Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Sunday lecture. And today the lecture is called The Sun at the Center of the Earth. So I'm going to be lecturing today probably for about maybe 2 hours, maybe a little bit less, give or take. And then I'm going to be answering any questions about the lecture on my website for my members. So if you're not a member yet, go ahead and sign up because I'll just be doing members only questions today after the lecture. And we'll go there for probably about another hour or so. Okay. So I'm going to be streaming today also on Rumble, YouTube, and Facebook, as well as obviously my own platform. So hello to everybody wherever you're watching me. And today is technically going to be the first lecture in a series of lectures that I'm going to be doing that are called the Venus Mysteries. So we're going to talk about the sun at the center of the earth. But by the end of the lecture, we're already going to be rolling into the significance of Venus and its relationship to the earth and the sun and the black sun. So it actually is the first Venus Mysteries lecture. So I'm sure also the little video that was streaming beforehand, you probably saw the Earth go from basically having a little darker black circle at the center of it for 3 cycles. And then you see a flash of light. And then you see the Earth get lighter and lighter and lighter for another 3 cycles. And that is sort of that little video at the first little part of this lecture is really showing the evolution of the Earth from a cosmic perspective. And so that's how we're going to look at this lecture today, is how the Earth interacts with our sun, with other spheres, and how our Earth is really turning into a sun or turning into a star in its own right, and how the Earth at the end of its evolution really, and really beginning now moving forward, is really producing its own kind of light, a new kind of light. And that every star, in order for it to technically be a star or a sun, has to eventually emit its own light. It has to create something new. And so we're going to look at the evolution of the Earth on those terms. So what does it mean when somebody says something like there's a sun inside the Earth, or inner sun, or there's a sun at the core of the Earth? You know, that seems like a really bizarre thing to say, because we know in the physical realm, you can't really have a sun at the center of the Earth necessarily in a completely physical way, the way we understand it. So when we say sun at the center of the Earth, what's really going on is we're talking about a spiritual sun. So we're talking about the Earth not just as a physical material being, right? But the Earth actually as a spiritual being with, you could say, many different layers or sheaths. Just like how the human being has an aura of different layers and sheaths, so does the Earth, right? And so that's how we're going to look at the Earth today. So when we understand that the Earth is actually a spiritual being, we can see that there's a spiritual layer of the Earth that is technically a sun. It's technically like a vortex point, because every sun also is really a vortex point that leads into yet another plane. And so every planet is too, but when you get into the planetary level, it just gets a little bit different. So the sun at the center of the Earth, thus, is really a vortex point. Okay, it's the earthly vortex point, if you will. And so and again, it's not it's not like a physical phenomenon. Like sometimes you'll hear people talk about the sun at the center of the Earth, and there's no discernment about whether this is like a physical phenomenon or if it's a spiritual phenomenon or what the difference is. The the spiritual science is not delineated properly, and so it leaves room for a lot of, I guess you could say, conflation. So now that we understand that there is a vortex point at the center of the earth, at the core of the earth, in the spiritual dimension, in the spiritual planes, then our next question is, well, what is its purpose? Why is it there? What function does it have for the earth and for humanity? So the sun at the center of the earth unites the earth with its higher counterparts, with the higher planes. And so cosmic energies enter into the earth through basically the core of the earth, the center of the earth, as spiritual forces and materialize through the center of the earth and are able to appear here. And now this is obviously a spiritual process. Okay, so in a sense, you could say that the sun at the center of the earth allows soul essences to come through and cosmic forces to come through from different planetary spheres. So through the center of the earth, we see basically the transmigration of souls, or we see that souls basically enter into the earth from, their point of incarnation. So when you pass away, you move through the cosmos in a certain order, and then you come back into an earthly incarnation through the sun at the center of the earth. And that patterns you with, that process then patterns you with the different forces of the earth and the earthly body, and then you take a life on the earth. So in this way, the center of the earth is also very comparable to a womb, right? And when we get into Black Sun, we'll get into that a little bit more. So souls enter, if you're going to take an earthly life, souls enter the earth through the center of the earth, okay? And then they materialize from that point into the earthly archetypes that are needed to live. Now, when you pass away, it's also the same kind of process. So you also exit through the earth, and that's where you get all of the imagery of going into the underworld, and why, whether you go back into very early shamanic traditions or even more modern thought, there's always that mythology and that story about the soul having to descend into the earth and go into the underworld and pass through basically the layers of the inner earth, or the layers of the underworld. And then it passes through a certain vortex point, and then it begins to actually enter the heavenly planes. So we're actually, when we talk about the sun at the center of the earth, this vortex point at the center of the earth, which is a solar point, we're really talking about birth and death. And it's a very big part of that. But of course, if you've watched my lecture called The Electric Apocalypse, I go pretty deeply into the underworld and the inner earth in that lecture, and the second portion of that lecture as well. So if you want more about passing into the underworld and that mythos and its connection to the inner earth, then I suggest checking out that lecture. And there's one more important detail about the sun at the center of the earth that we need to understand, besides its role in birth and besides its role in death. And that is that in the earlier period of humanity, so we're talking about the Polarian epoch, Hyperborean epoch, Lemurian epoch, and partway through the Atlantean epoch, we're actually also seeing angelic beings coming through the center of the earth as well, in a specific way, right? So we're having angels, beings from the spiritual hierarchies, also coming through the center of the earth and materializing here or manifesting here in order to guide and lead humanity and go through a certain initiation process with humanity to make sure that humanity is evolving. Now, this involves a sacrifice for them. So there is a kind of death and rebirth for them as well, but it's different than human souls incarnating. Now we're talking about angelic beings coming, and basically, this is when we hear about, in Anthroposophy and Theosophy and Greek and Roman myths about these gods that would walk amongst humanity. These are these angels that were coming from really higher spheres and entering in through the earth and materializing here. So you basically have all kinds of comings and goings through the center of the earth, because the center of the earth, especially in earlier periods, is kind of like the point of materialization, right? So that's how higher spiritual beings that you would really call angels would come through as well. Okay, but for them, it's sort of like, for an angel who is coming to the earth, it's kind of like an excarnation, right? It's not the same as an incarnation for them. It's a different process, but it's the same channel. It's the same pathway. And that's also why you'll hear sometimes strange stories about beings appearing from caves, or, the holy wells. Later on in this series of lectures I call Venus Mysteries, we will get into the holy wells and this idea of people coming up from the earth and appearing that way. And that has to do with the esoteric anatomy of the earth and how spiritual forces manifest here in a certain way, which is the same thing to do with birth and death. Okay, so now we're going to add one more variable, one more element. We've already talked about the reality that there is a sun at the center of the earth that is a spiritual sun that acts as a vortex point, or kind of like a transformation point between the earth and higher worlds. Now we're going to add one more variable, which is the reality that that sun can be charged in different ways. Okay, it can be considered a black sun force. It can be considered a white sun force. Now, this isn't really completely understandable from a material perspective. We're still in the realm of astral matter and ether, and we're still in the spiritual plane of things. And so we're going to get into basically the black sun force, the white sun force, and Christ, and how Christ plays into that. Because Christ is the force, the Christ being and the Christ essence is technically the force that actually changes a planetary sphere from being a black sun force from the perspective of the solar plane to a white sun force, or to a star that emits a special kind of light. So before Christ, the earth is in essentially a black sun phase or an involution phase. And then after Christ, it enters technically a true phase of evolution, like a true, by definition, evolution phase. So when you look at the earth, and you look at the earth pretty much pre-Christ, so in the Atlantean epoch, in the Lemurian epoch, and even before, in spiritual science, usually the term involution is used. So the earth was in a phase of involution. Now, involution is not the same thing as devolution. I often see these two phrases being conflated. So people use the word involution and devolution to mean the same thing. They're actually different. So devolution is basically degeneration. So it means that the form or some organ is being degenerated. It's fragmenting. It's rotting. It's becoming slowly non-functional. It's rotting. But involution is basically different when it comes to human and planetary development. So involution is not degeneration. There's a point where it will become devolution if the Christ impulse is not accepted. But involution, for a large portion of the Earth's development, half of it, is actually just the absorption of and recapitulation of prior planetary developments into the Earth. So technically, Involution is really just the recapitulations of the prior earthly phases. So when the earth takes a new embodiment, right, it recapitulates all of its prior phases. And then it gets to a point where it must receive Christ and create something new, right? This new thing in Anthroposophy is technically the humanity rising into the angels of love and freedom, or basically humanity reaches yet a new stage and a higher stage of initiation. Okay, so the kind of the first half of the Earth's evolution, really, or the Earth's life, is kind of a black sun period of involution where the Earth itself isn't really its own thing. Like the Earth in Lemuria is not really technically producing anything new. If you can imagine the Earth being part of a system of interlocking spheres all relating to one another, other spheres are pouring into the Earth all of their karma, all of their life force, all of their energy, and that's kind of creating that's what's creating the life on Earth spiritually. So the Earth is really in the image of higher spheres. So nothing new is technically being created in the earlier epochs of the Earth. Okay, it's technically, the Earth is technically recapitulating prior developments that came before it. But then the Earth will reach a point of evolution and it will begin to create, technically it's a new substrate, right? It will begin to create something new. And that's kind of the whole point of the Earth. The whole point of the Earth is ultimately to create something new, right? So the point that something new again is created is usually the midpoint of the Earth. In Anthroposophy, this is called the turning point of time for a reason, because something new is finally going to come to pass in humanity. And when Christ does incarnate, which is the Logos, which is God, which is the solar force itself, then that enters the Earth, and that begins the final cycle of ascension and spiritualization, and the Earth turns into a white sun or into a star, and it begins to actually create something new. It begins to create a new substrate, actually. Humanity becomes glorified and the master and kind of creator of that new sort of ether, that new substrate, which would be known as the glorified etheric body. Okay, so does that make sense? Don't forget that I'll be answering any questions about this after the lecture for members only. So if you have any questions, I will be taking them there. And if you're not, I will be doing a live stream again on YouTube, and I can take your questions then. All right. Or be sure to leave them in the comment section, and I can maybe also make some follow-up videos if it's unclear. So the pre-Christ world is one of involution, and from the solar plane is technically a black sun force. And it's materializing, right? The whole earlier phase of the planet is basically becoming denser and denser and denser and denser, right? It's materializing, it's pulling in the forces really technically of other worlds and is an evolution of those worlds. It is trying to evolve those higher worlds through materializing that karma, materializing those forces, and then evolving it, creating something new and rising it, right? This is the cosmic reality of the Earth, its relationship to the other planetary spheres, okay? So once we get into the post-Christ world, you get the white sun forces. You get spiritualization, and again, I want to make this really clear because there's a difference between the light of the old world, which is technically Lucifer, right? And you'll find out more about that in the last section of this, how Venus was the main light source of the Earth in the pre-Christ period, which is why it's considered associated with Lucifer and the old light. But the old light, which is symbolized by Lucifer or Lucifer gnosis, is not the same as the light of Christ. So the light of Lucifer and the Luciferic force is not the same light. It's not the same energy as Christ. They're actually very different energies. And so the Christ light is technically the new light. It is the new spiritual force that is created by the reality that humanity had to go through a transformation and actually learn to emit this light themselves. So in a sense, the old light, which is associated with Lucifer, is a dead light. It's a dying light because it wasn't humanity's. It was given to humanity through the sphere of Venus because they didn't have the organs for that yet. But there comes a point when humanity must emit their own light. And that can only be done through the incarnation of Christ and the transformation that occurs when that being incarnates into a body and into the earth. It has the power to create new light, a new life, new light, a new force, a new ether is created, a new kind of light ether is created. Does that make sense? So this is why sometimes you'll hear people talking about like conflating like Lucifer is the same as Christ. They're totally different. And just because you're reading about light in an old spiritual text, right, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it's even referring to Lucifer. It could be referring to the Christ force. So there's a lot of conflation between the idea of Lucifer as light and Lucifer's early initiating influence on the planet through Venus and the Christ's light and that effect during the turning point in time, like 2,000 years ago. There's a difference between those two initiations, and we have to understand them because the incarnation of Christ turns the earth essentially into a star or begins the earth to create this new light. Okay? So there is a spiritual vortex or sun at the center of the earth. The earth in this sense is simultaneously a star, or is to eventually become a star by the end of its evolutionary cycle. Souls pass through this sun when they incarnate and when they pass away. In earlier periods of human development, angelic beings from the outer spheres at times materialize through the center of the earth to assist humanity. And by the way, I have to say this because it's just so crazy out there. When I'm talking about a spiritual being that's from another sphere materializing on the earth, I'm not talking about like ancient aliens or aliens, as many of you know. I'm talking about spiritual beings from the spiritual hierarchies, which work in tandem with us for our development, that live within the orbit of the different planetary spheres. Okay? So during the Earth's involution, the sun is kind of negatively oriented, or it's a black sun force from the perspective of the solar plane. And later, upon the reception of the Christ being, the sun becomes positively oriented. The sun at the center of the earth becomes positively oriented and is considered a white sun and expanding to become a star. And to qualify as a star, or to technically be a sun, it is not just that light must be emitted, but it must be a new light. Something new must be produced by humanity. So I'm going to say this again. In the earlier period, when you see the light bearers from Venus, like Lucifer, right, that is not a new light for humanity. It was then, but technically it was really the light of Venus given to humanity, okay? It was something carried over and given to Earth to begin from and evolve, right? In order for the Earth to become a star and to finish its evolution, and in order for humanity to spiritualize and ascend or build their glorified etheric body, they have to produce something new or transubstantiate their matter into a glorified ether. Does that make sense? So something new must be produced in order for that light to be considered real. Otherwise, it is literally just recycled light from a prior system that was given to the earth to continue on. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So we know that we now know that there is a sun in the center of the earth. We know that the earth goes through a period of involution in its very early periods, from the Polarian epoch, the Hyperborean epoch, the Lemurian epoch, and even part of the Atlantean epoch would be considered that. And then we know the effect of Christ on the earth now. So this is really an important part of esoteric science. And it has been conveyed in the past by, you could say, literary myths and stories. It wasn't really taught directly because it is kind of a complex topic, though I do think that Theosophy and Anthroposophy do a pretty good job at hinting at things quite a bit. But in around the mid-1800s, this concept starts to become taught more and more and more. And we start to see various different works that come forward that start talking about this world in the center of the earth, and that the center of the earth is kind of like this spiritual world or this spiritual plane. And so we see this idea be taught in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, in Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race, and also in Yuri Lloyd's Etidorfa. And so we're going to watch a little clip on that now. An advanced group of people living within. In 1871, Edward Bulwer Lytton wrote the science fiction book The Coming Race. In this novel, he describes the strange journey of a man who discovers an advanced group of people living within the earth. These people have a powerful internal magnetism that they call vril. They have a magical existence and are able to influence the material world with their minds. The book became popular upon its release and has gained a cult following in modern times. Many people feel that Lytton was using fiction to reveal certain secrets about the Earth's ancient past and true spiritual nature. They feel he was using story and metaphor to hint that the Earth has a hidden spiritual life, and that other planes of existence are mysteriously intertwined with our own material existence. The idea of the coming race is actually a theosophical concept and refers to the coming of the next root race, or the next cultural evolution of humanity that will take place in what Anthroposophy calls the sixth cultural age. However, it should be noted that the new humanity of the sixth cultural age is not an actual hidden race of people living within the earth. It is not technically a physical race as we know the concept of race today at all. The people of the sixth cultural age are a certain wave of souls from a certain region of heaven that will enter into the bodies of all races. Thus, the coming race refers to the advanced souls that are beginning to incarnate on the earth now to establish the sixth cultural epoch of the earth. Stories of people venturing underground to discover an advanced culture continues in Etidorfa by John Uri Lloyd. 14 years after The Coming Race, another book emerges describing a similar concept. The book is called Etidorfa, which is, of course, Aphrodite backwards. In this book, a man ventures with a strange blue-skinned guide into a cave in Kentucky. Here he goes through a series of trials that seem to reveal to the reader certain mysteries about life, cloaked in metaphor, of course. This kind of fiction is also similar to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, which was initially titled Alice's Adventures Underground. Alice in Wonderland, published in 1865, predates both Lytton's The Coming Race and Yuri Lloyd's Etidorfa. Descending into the underworld is an integral part of the Venus mysteries, or the feminine aspect of the mysteries. In mystery science, Aphrodite is also the planet Venus, and as you will see as we continue in this lecture, Venus is the higher aspect of the Earth, or the sister aspect of the Earth, and the Earth's core was united with Venus and in a certain symbiotic relationship with it until the incarnation of Christ in the Greco-Roman era. Thus, these stories are revealing the spiritual connection between the Earth and Venus during the Earth's pre-Christ period. All right, so a little video clip there describing how this talk about these spiritual beings assisting humanity coming from the center of the earth was normally talked about in myths. It wasn't necessarily taught as a spiritual scientific thing, and we weren't really supposed to do that until our period now. So we also have these different, the same sort of idea through the concept of Shambhala, Agartha, and even Valhalla. So there's always been this idea of this city or this place that isn't quite on the earth and it isn't quite in heaven. It's sort of like this in-between place where the gods live. And so that is really revealing to us a lot about the esoteric anatomy of the earth, and that the earth really, like the material earth really is an expression of, you could say, or higher spheres and meshing with it and depositing certain forces. And eventually the sun doing that to the point that the earth will reunite with the sun much later. So this is actually the real evolutionary cycle of the earth, as it absorbs these properties from the planetary spheres, but mainly Venus, okay? So during the earlier part of the earth, the pre-Christ part of the earth, it was actually the planet Venus that was kind of like a stand-in, kind of like a mother that was nursing the earth and allowing the earth to receive the sun's forces, which all planets within our solar system need, without it destroying the earth. So in the earlier period, Venus is like a stand-in, and it's overlapping the earth in the earlier periods. So a lot of the things about Shambhala, Agartha, Valhalla, even potentially things like Avalon or High Brazil, these places that seem to appear and disappear are really what you could call the plane of really Venus, or what you could call maybe Earth Venus. It's kind of like there's periods of time where the planes merge, because from the esoteric perspective, the Earth is actually not different from any of the planetary spheres it shares the sun with. Technically every planetary sphere is simply the Earth in a different condition, right? The spirit of the Earth in a different condition, or the sun in a different condition. And so once you see that, you can see that the sun is the Earth is also absorbing these different energies from the spheres, but mainly the major one really was Venus. And so you could say that Venus was in a direct union with the Earth and providing all of its sustenance, and everything would kind of go through Venus officially. And in that way, Venus is kind of like the Earth's higher self, and the Earth is in the image of Venus. And that's why, you know, in Etidorfa is just Aphrodite backwards. Aphrodite is Venus. And so that's Uri Lloyd's way of saying Venus is rooted in the center of the Earth. And Venus is the in-between force, and the sun at the center of the Earth, technically, for the longest time, was really attuned to Venus, right? And there was a direct line, a direct chain between them. All right. And obviously, you know, the idea of, you know, in the coming race with Edward Bulwer Lytton, we see that, you know, the race, the center of the Earth has angel wings. You know, they're it's not portraying, you know, like alien beings or something. It's portraying Venusians. It's portraying, you know, as Rudolf Steiner would say, the spirits of personality. It's portraying the spiritual hierarchy that is, you could say, leading and guiding and protecting the Earth and making sure that the Earth reaches its potential, you could say. And that lies not somewhere up in the cosmos in like a spaceship, but it actually has more to do with the inner Earth, not the physical cavern system of the Earth, right? Because this is the other thing, and we'll get into kind of the 1940s version of this. So once 1940s, 1950s comes along and we're in that post-war period, suddenly there's this obsession with technology, and, you know, we're touched by science fiction. Everything becomes science fiction and about aliens and technology, and we start rewriting every single esoteric teaching in the image of technology and the image of aliens, and it just starts to unzip, you know, the real esoteric teachings that we need and deform them and contort them. And so when you look in modern spirituality, there's a really toxic conflation between what you could call the real teachings about the inner Earth, which directly relate to Christ, to Venus, to understanding that transition from going from a black sun force initially to a white sun force through the Christ process. So it starts out as this incredible, deep, and powerful transformational teaching about the evolution of a planet and Christ, right, and humanity. And then it starts to slowly deform into basically stories about the shallow cavern systems of the Earth and, you know, aliens living in there with technology. And it starts to, you know, the physical inner Earth. There are cavern systems in the inner Earth. But that's, or there are, like, I shouldn't even say inner Earth. There are cavern systems that are technically pretty shallow that exist, you know, on the Earth plane. They're material cavern systems. And within those cavern systems are what you could call breakaway civilizations. So every single epoch, there is catastrophes that end it. And at times, there's these different migrations that occur after each catastrophe. And so when we're looking at the Atlantean catastrophe, we see the fall of Atlantis, and we actually have breakaway civilizations or breakaway groups. I shouldn't really say civilizations, but kind of like breakaway groups that took refuge in the Earth. Not the spiritual inner Earth, because they're not Christed beings. You know, they're just really probably more like degenerated humans. They took refuge in the material Earth and the cavern system. And so there's a lot of conflation in modern esoterica today, thinking that, you know, these technologically advanced people and weird things that are from the cavern system in the Earth that are just left over from Atlantis that these are angels or that these are aliens. And there's a real misunderstanding between the actual spiritual teaching of inner earth and what's going on in these cavern systems, which is literally just, like what Edgar Casey would call the Belial faction, or, Blavatsky called it the Lords of the Dark Face. Like, it's just a continuation of last epoch. They just went underground and they've been there ever since. So I understand it's kind of like a strange concept, but there's going to come a point in time when you're going to need to know the difference between the two. You're going to need to know the difference between the actual inner earth and its spiritual layers, and how the earth interacts with other spheres through a specific system of interrelated channels that are to do with the sun at the center of the earth. You're going to need to know what that is. And you're going to need to also know what a breakaway society is that's trying to act like gods are. You're going to need to be able to discern the fake from the real. And the only way we can do this is through understanding spiritual science and the real esoteric teachings behind what makes the earth tick, what turns the earth into a star, right? So really, we need to understand the Christ being, right? So the idea of the inner sun and its interface with higher worlds was portrayed in Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, in Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race, and Yuri Lloyd's Edidorfa. So obviously, when you look at Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, that is a Persephone myth. That is the myth of what we're going to call in the Venus mysteries, the Venus initiate, or the Mary soul, right? Or Sophia. That is her myth. That is the Venus myth. And so you see it most complete in Alice in Wonderland because it retains the feminine lead, right? But you also see the reference to the inner earth as a spiritual place, obviously, in The Coming Race and in Edidorfa. And Edidorfa obviously is Aphrodite, which is Venus. And Bulwer Lytton kind of references the Venusian aspect of inner earth by saying that, the society, men and women are equal, and referring to sort of a very Venusian style existence. So again, I want to just clarify the connection between the inner earth and Venus. Okay, so again, in the pre-Christ period of the earth, Venus really surrounded the earth and was the intermediary between the sun and the earth, because the earth has to be prepared essentially to receive the sun, because the sun is so powerful. So when the earth is in this early period of involution, it's really just, it's like a baby, and it's just receiving all of its archetypal influences, all of its patterns. The life wave is just getting going, and it's Venus. Venus is the sphere that was the stand-in that was contributing the majority of that energy. And so that is the connection between Venus and the inner earth, because for the earlier period of the earth, where people were actually manifested, especially from Lemuria to most of Atlantis, it was really the Venusian sphere that was the greatest influence as technically the earth's higher self. So that is why the center of the earth could actually technically be called Venus, right? Because if the center of the earth is technically a portal or a vortex, and in the first part of the earth's life, it's technically a receiving portal or a black sun essence, then it's really receiving Venus. Therefore, the center of the earth, you could call Venus, you could call it Shambhala, you could call it Agartha, but what you're really calling it is Earth Venus, or Venus Earth. So that's what you would call it cosmologically. Pop culture and modern spirituality has also included the idea of the inner sun, though over time it often becomes too literal and materialist in its explanation. So again, you have this idea of the inner sun being a spiritual thing, and it being angels from the Venusian plane, right? Spirits of personality, or archai, as Rudolf Steiner would say, or Blavatsky would say, the lords of the flame, or she would say the lords of Venus, right? And so you have that as a totally spiritual teaching with many different dimensions. And then in our period, that gets turned into like aliens from Venus, like alien beings came from Venus, and that's what it turns into in our modern time. These are, so we have to watch that intersection very closely. That intersection meaning where are spiritual concepts becoming too literalist and too materialist at the expense of truly understanding them. Because if we don't understand them, we're not going to understand something within ourselves. Because every one of these massive cosmic processes I'm talking about today is a process within you on the microcosm, right? So to provide balance, we must understand the esoteric anatomy of the earth. Okay. So we've already kind of covered a lot of that in prior lectures and even in this one in the beginning. So I'll kind of breeze through this. So the earth technically is only material where we are, but then it actually has different sheaths that surround it, like this, going out, okay? Just like the human body has an aura, right? Has a physical body, and then it has an etheric body, and then it has an astral body, and then even yet higher forms of astral bodies, right? The earth is the exact same way. So the earth being, right? Because we have to also think of the earth as a being. Everything is actually a being, right? From the perspective of spiritual science, we are surrounded by beings. The earth is a being, you're a being, angels are beings, plants are beings, minerals are beings. Everything is actually a being and alive in different stages of development. So that's actually very important that we understand this. So the earth being actually extends upwards into the cosmos, and then that's reflected also in the spiritual dimensions, technically beneath the earth. So the idea of kind of Alice going through the mirror, right? And the idea of going through a mirror is really true. So how the next place that we go, because now we know that the earth technically has these different planes. Now these different planes have different names in different spiritual traditions. So in the closest thing in traditional Christianity would be the different heavens. So in Christianity, there's like the first heaven, the second heaven, there's these different heavens, right? So the astral world is really called heaven in esoteric Christianity and traditional Christianity, and there's different grades of heaven. Now, in the Eastern tradition, you would just hear like Devachan, and, in the New Age, it's like the fifth dimension, these are all different words for like the astral plane or the different sort of planes of the earth. But you can't actually enter into the idea of the different planes of the earth unless you actually understand the earth's relationship to the different planetary spheres. So each planet, if you use a geocentric model or a Ptolemaic model, and you have the earth, okay, and then you have all the different planets that would be going out from it and surrounding it. So not a sun-centered, but a geocentric model. The geocentric model is the model of the soul and the human experience, right? Because we're not a sun, we're on the earth. So we use the earth-centered one for spiritual science a lot of the time. If you look at the planets going out from the earth, right? So you have the closer planets like Venus and Mars and Mercury, things like that. And then you have going out, you have the further ones, Jupiter, Saturn, whatever. The orbits of the planets are like the different heavens, if you will. Okay. So the spiritual beings of the spiritual hierarchies they don't live on the planet Venus, right? They don't like live on the physical planet. The physical planet is like a shell to represent where the plane is for us. It's a material representation of the boundary of worlds. So in between the Earth and the planetary sphere, if you can imagine them both orbiting, that space is technically a plane of existence. And within that plane, you have a bunch of spiritual beings that operate. Okay. So you could call those beings members of the spiritual hierarchy. You could call them angels. You know, in the Eastern traditions, they would say devas, right? D-E-V-A-S. Devas is another word for angels. So they exist. There's a different class of angels, essentially, in these different planes, okay, of existence. And the other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these different planes around the earth, the different heavens of the earth, is that every single plane is a different substrate. It's a different kind of astral matter. It's a different kind of substrate. Does that make sense? So it's not earthly substrate. It technically where the beings live, where the beings come from, it's a different substrate. For them to interact with another sphere, they have to create the substrate to enter into that other sphere. Okay, does that make sense? Because in modern teachings, there's this idea that you can like hop in a spaceship and you can go to whatever dimension you want. You can go anywhere in time that you want. You can go to other worlds. But that's not actually how the earth operates or how the cosmos operates. Okay, so technically, the region where these spiritual beings exist is associated with a planetary sphere. It's really the orbit of that sphere in relationship to the earth. And in that orbit, it's technically a different kind of substrate. It's a different kind of matter, of astral matter. So that's why we can't see them, is because they're operating in a different, it's not just a different dimension, it's a different substrate, right? Because when you think about like when someone uses just the word dimension, like when spirituality becomes too scientificized, it's like the different dimensions. It's like, okay, but a different dimension isn't just matter speeding up at a higher rate until it creates a different dimension. It's actually a different quality of matter entirely. So there's a shift that goes on. Okay. So this leads us to how can we understand how to relate to these beings, to relate to these higher worlds, and how do they relate to us if it's a different kind of substrate? The only way that a human being can reach into a higher sphere, which would be like heaven, is through transubstantiation, a process of transubstantiation. The only way an angelic being on the inverse too can come to the earth is through a kind of transubstantiation as well. So there's no spaceship that's going to like do this for you. There's no machine that you're going to like step into that's going to transubstantiate you into a higher plane. You know, this is like some weird science fiction, you know, techno propaganda that's trying to remove the process of resurrection, remove the process of building the glorified etheric body or diamond body or immortal body. You don't have to build that. No, you just like go get a chip in your brain, or you just like go have this time machine. These are lies. Okay, this is a lie. It's a lie to usher people into thinking that technology can perform the real resurrection. You know, uploading your consciousness into a machine, or that technology can take the place of real spiritual evolution, which, to put it simply, is for humanity to learn to build what is called the glorified etheric body or the resurrection body and evolve with the sun and become light, become a star with the earth. You can't do that through machinery. You can't do that through technology. You have to do it through a process of inner transubstantiation. I've already lectured on this. The lecture is called The Immortal Body. So I won't go into that anymore to save everyone some time. So to get from the material earth as a material person to another plane, any other plane, you have to transubstantiate the element of matter. There's no way. And the only way you do that is through your own being, through overcoming your fear, through uniting with Christ within your being, through living a certain way, gradually through right living, through uniting with Christ, through spiritual life. You build your etheric body to be glorified, to be immortal. So when you pass away, essentially you enter into that glorified etheric body and you continue on in your existence. Now that is the true idea of getting off of the wheel of samsara. It doesn't just magically happen. You have to build your etheric body, which can also be called the phantom, the glorified phantom, the diamond body, the body immortal. The whole point of spiritual life is to be able to do that. And when you pass away, you enter into that glorified etheric body, which is actually a new substrate. It's a light. It is a higher kind of etheric substrate that is transformed matter. It's alchemy, right? That's the whole point of alchemy, the teachings of alchemy was to create this. Okay. So that is the only way that your soul can get off of the planet. There's no shortcuts. There's no secrets. You can't go to Mars, okay? You can't go to some other planet for a while. You have to develop your resurrection body and evolve with the earth as the earth builds its glorified body, which is really the body of Christ. Okay? Which is now the body of Christ. The etheric body of the earth is truly the body of Christ, the great Christ being, and we unite with that and enter into that and evolve and become a star with the earth. Okay, so that is our true path that we are entitled to. All right, can you guys hear that thunder and lightning that's going on right now? It has been such a beautiful spring here. It has been so stormy. I love that. So hopefully it won't get too windy. All right. So people have achieved this. People have been able to essentially pass through the sun at the center of the earth. They've been able to consciously do this. And these people are called saints. They're called masters or ascended masters. They're called Buddhas, bodhisattvas sometimes. These are all the holy titles of individuals who have learned to do this to varying degrees and have control, some level of control over their glorified body, right? Which means that's how you become interplanetary, okay? Like that's the real meaning of being a cosmic entity, right? So, all right. Another good thing to think of with the idea of, you're not going to get into a spaceship and like live forever, that kind of thing. Even when you see like the planet Mars, or you see the planet Venus, or you see Saturn, like any planet that you see, technically what you're seeing is Earth, Mars, Earth, Venus, Earth, Saturn. You're seeing that planet's representation on the material plane, which is also the earthly plane, right? So eventually this plane will go through a big transition, and Mars will come into that, and transhumanism kind of comes into that. But that's a whole other lecture entirely. The point is to say that every plane of existence is really its own substrate. It's not just like matter vibrating at a faster rate. It's a different substrate in which humanity has to learn to create. And we do that through the transubstantiation of matter, which is the mysteries of resurrection. Okay? So, all planes are evolution of the earth. Okay, so the earth has various heavens or higher planes that interlace with the material plane. These higher planes of the earth are marked by the planets in the solar system, or the planetary spheres. And they have their own activities and their own angelic hierarchy. And humanity is part of that angelic hierarchy. Keep this in mind. Humanity is the 10th angel in the angelic hierarchy. So we eventually, as the earth completes its cycle, we will become, in the anthroposophical system, the angels of love and freedom. And think about that. It actually kind of makes sense when you think of how the world is going, that, if we learn anything from this, it's going to be loving and to appreciate freedom, right? So that's actually the angels that we will potentially one day become, should we meet our destiny and be able to evolve with the earth as it becomes a sun. All right. So that is our destiny. But there are forces that seek to try to create an unnatural path or thwart that destiny as well. So we have to always know that. These higher planes of the earth are marked by the planets in the solar system and have their own activities and angelic hierarchy. They also have their own spiritual substrate or quality. In order to go beyond the earth plane, you must transubstantiate yourself or build your resurrection body. Beings who have done this are called spiritual masters, Buddhas, saints, and so on and so forth. So really, at the end of the day, what we're looking at is a system of human initiation. So it's like, okay, Gigi, that's great that there's like a vortex at the center of the earth that connects with other planetary spheres, basically a stargate. Great, but how does that relate to me? Well, it relates to the individual, because all this relationship with the different planetary spheres and the sun is basically just creating the process of spiritual initiation, taking a soul in the beginning of a planetary cycle from almost like a child. How we were operating in Lemuria was basically a hive mind. We didn't have an I, we weren't individuals, we were basically human beings with an animal kind of consciousness, right? And then through initiation, which is partly the earth interaction with higher spheres, we become individuals. And then we glorify that through acknowledging forces greater than ourselves and joining them. So this is also a conversation about the process of human initiation, going from basically a child to an adult and graduating as an angel ourselves eventually one day in the distant future, should we understand our role, should we understand our destiny. And so that's how we can personally relate to it. So let's get a little bit into Venus, because this lecture series is the Venus mysteries. So we have to understand how the planet Venus relates to the Earth, how certain waves of souls can come from Venus. Just to get back to that little clip I played, it was talking about the idea of the coming race. And, Lytton wrote The Coming Race, and he used the word race. In my opinion, he was very interested in Theosophy. And he was talking about sort of the next root race of humanity that was going to come about in the 6th cultural age. Right now, we're in the 5th cultural age. And so the idea of the coming race with Bulwer Lytton was that humanity is going to eventually receive these souls that really come from the sphere of Venus, right? And that is going to be the foundation for the coming race. And that happens through, in an esoteric, very hidden in the mystery schools, the idea of Venus being this heavenly interface for the earth, the stand-in for the sun, the protector of the earth's higher self. And so that's why Lloyd called it Edidorfa or Aphrodite, which is Venus. That's why Lewis Carroll basically recreated the Persephone myth in Alice in Wonderland. You know, people think that Alice in Wonderland is strictly some creepy MK Ultra thing, but the only reason why people use Alice in Wonderland symbology in MK Ultra stuff is because it's before MK Ultra even existed. It was a modern Persephone myth that deeply relates to the feminine psyche of humanity in its symbology. So they just stole it and used it. And it's unfortunate when people see like a white rabbit, or they see like an Alice imagery, like a checkerboard or something, you know, from Alice, and they get creeped out. That's so unfortunate, because, you know, that is a Persephone myth. And it's probably the most popular Persephone myth today. The second most popular would be Wizard of Oz. You know, but also Sleeping Beauty is up there, and there's some other ones too. But these are Venus myths, okay? Edidorfa, the idea of going into the earth, that's like finding Shambhala. Shambhala is Earth Venus, right? And the angelic beings from Venus were the gods of old, okay? So let's go even deeper into the idea of Venus as really the great mother and the intermediary of the earth. Like a good way to see it is like Venus is nursing the earth and providing the earth with all the patterns of development and initiations in its earlier period that it needs. And so there were different mystics that talked about Venus, but Venus was always something that people didn't really want to talk about too much. Actually, you'll find in earlier spiritual teachings a lot of stuff about the higher spheres or outer spheres was really avoided. And I think that the reason why the mysteries of Venus and the mysteries of Mars and Mercury, the reason why I don't think they were elaborated on was to prevent exactly what's happening now, which is people taking an incredibly literalist approach to the planets without actually understanding the esoteric teachings. And I think that they saw that, and that's exactly what's happening. And so you'll read in, you know, different theosophical letters and things like that, you'll read about Blavatsky saying that she won't reveal the secret of Mars and the Earth and Mercury and the Earth and Venus and the Earth. She'll only give little pieces, you know, in regards to Lemuria and the Lords of the Flame. And Blavatsky gives little hints at what Venus is. And so does Alice Bailey, and so does Rudolf Steiner. And actually so does Pythagoras. And these different, you know, mystery figures will give these little hints about Venus and the different planetary spheres. You'll also find some hints about Mars and Rosicrucianism through alchemy, but they really don't get into the idea of the soul waves coming from these different spheres precisely, and why. Maybe they did if you were very high up in the order, but it wasn't something that was really taught, because in my opinion, you know, I think that they thought that people were going to misunderstand it because of how literalist we have become. And this actually happened with A.P. Sunat. He was supposed to describe the eighth sphere in his work Esoteric Buddhism. And he ends up describing it in a literalist, materialist way, and basically saying that the eighth sphere is the moon. And the eighth sphere technically is not even created yet. It is the substrate that will create the eighth sphere is technically, between the moon and the earth. It does involve lunar energies, but it's not the moon. So that was somebody who was very well read, had incredible exposure to probably the most deep and advanced occult knowledge anyone. I mean, he was around these incredible theosophists all the time. He probably had access to knowledge in libraries a lot of other people didn't. He was immersed in it. And he didn't get the eighth sphere right because of literalism and materialism. And it's actually not a matter of logical anything. It's actually a spiritual state that you have to develop and be in order to understand other spheres. Like there's certain parts of esoterica that you're just going to get to a brick wall and you're just going to hit your head against it because part of your mind is going to want to make it literal. It's going to want to make it like a materialist concept. Like we crave that, we want that, but the concept doesn't exist at all in the material world. It's totally a transcendent idea that basically like dips its toe in this world for a second as a symbol or as a, like a metaphor, simile, and then it goes back up. So it's really something that you have to, you have to receive. It's a different faculty actually. And so this is why there isn't yet a complex teaching about this, despite lots of different initiates knowing about it. It was this fear that people would start taking everything too literally, which is exactly what's happening. We literally have, people saying that they're going to build these spaceships and live on these different planets. And we have the most bizarre cosmology right now that one day, and by the way, I'm not saying that these different planets don't exist, right? I'm saying that when you have another planetary sphere, it has its own life wave, right? So Mars has its own life wave. It will one day awaken and it will have its own life that is the Mars life based in the Mars forces. Venus has its own life cycle. So humanity doesn't just go to a planet, right, and just start dominating it and being like, now this is my planet and I'm just going to put the tomato plants over here and the buildings over here. I'm going to play God. That's not how it works. We have to actually build our resurrection body and transcend matter into the higher spheres that surround our world that we actually emerged from once upon a time. So you can see how the spiritual ideology of the transmigration of souls through planetary spheres has become things like aliens and that we need to colonize other worlds. That is just not understanding spiritual science, plain and simple. It's not that there isn't planets out there in the material plane, right? It's not that that they don't exist, right? It's that every single planetary sphere is a plane within itself and has an elemental kingdom that is unique to it, technically, when it comes to life. It has a plant kingdom, a human kingdom that will come to life that is not the earth human kingdom. Now, it may contain aspects of it if it arises from the karma of the earth in a different cycle, but it will not be the earthly human being. Only the earthly human being can be on Earth. Only the Venusian human being can be on Venus, right? So there's actually a difference between planetary spheres down to the spiritual level. And the spiritual level is just as real as the material world, if not more real. So there's this incredible like arrogance that's happening right now in regards to space and the cosmos. And, you know, I mean, it's even possible that the people who push this are perhaps even aware of this, and there's something deeper going on, which I've spoken about with trying to beat the life cycle to Mars or all these sort of different things that go on. I observe them very closely, But this is exactly the kind of thing, in my opinion, that different spiritual teachers were trying to avoid, because it leads to the creation ultimately of the eighth sphere. Because the only way that a human can live in space is through becoming a cyborg. Basically, you have to basically change your form into a transhumanist form. That's the only way the system will live in the orbit of space, or in, like, if you go too far through technology outside, you would have to change your form into like a machine form, right? So a lot of stuff about space travel, a lot of stuff about Mars. It's really just to be a counterpoint to resurrection, to be a counterpoint to building the immortal body, which is the only way that human beings will ever transcend the earth, right? Because the Mars that we see is really just Earth Mars. And we can get into like, Mars, the Mars cycle coming awake in the future, and Earth's role in that. But that's really a different discussion. What we have to know now is that at this point in time, that's Earth Mars, that's Earth Venus, and it's really just, they're markers of a spiritual plane in which there are beings that exist. So that's where we're going to be with it today. But the idea of Venus as the Earth's higher self, Venus as having this direct link to the center of the Earth, because the Earth and Venus are directly overlapped. And so that vortex point is basically very closely aligned. This was something that was hinted at, and I thought it'd be fun to close out our lecture today by reading to you various different quotes from different people talking about Venus. So Helena Blavatsky, who was the founder of Theosophy, she talked about Venus quite a bit in The Secret Doctrine. So I've gone ahead and grabbed those quotes, and I'm going to read them to you. They're from a couple different pages, but I've squished them together just so we can focus on Venus. So Blavatsky says, Venus is the, quote, little sun in which the solar orb stores his lights. Venus is the little sun in which the solar orb, so the big sun, stores his light. So here she's actually calling Venus a sun, a little sun. And then she goes on to say, light comes through Venus, who receives triple supply and gives 1/3 to the earth. This is where we have the idea of Venus as the mother nursing the earth, right? Venus is absorbing the solar impulse, right? And then giving 1/3 of its life, 1/3 of its energy to the earth, right? There's that direct connection between Venus and Earth. The Venus has literally in its earlier phases, and in Earth's earlier phases, been a nourishing sphere for the Earth. Like nursing it, feeding it, okay? So there you have the image of the goddess Venus feeding the Earth, right? Therefore, the two are called twin sisters. So because Earth receives Venus's energy and is made up of the impulses of Venus greatly, it is called twin sisters. The spirit of the Earth is subservient to Venus. Venus is the most occult, powerful, and mysterious of all planets. Its relation with the Earth is the most prominent. It presides over the natural generation of men. It is called the, quote, other sun. It is the Earth's primary or spiritual prototype. So again, here we're getting to this idea where that Venus sphere, so if you look at the Earth here at the center, the geocentric model of the Earth, and the planets are surrounding it, that plane of Venus is like technically like the etheric, the higher body of the Earth, the higher etheric form of the Earth. is how some initiates have called it in the past. And the earth is basically, if you look at the 7 planetary chain system, namely in Anthroposophy, you know, the earth moves through a Jupiter phase, which is kind of like this etheric phase, and then it moves into the Venus development. So the earth is like eventually absorbed into Venus in a sense. So it's almost like you could see the earth as being born from Venus, right? And then it kind of gets reabsorbed. And then it also gets reabsorbed into the sun eventually as well. And that's when you get, you know, like the most exalted phase. We can hardly even imagine it, but, you know, trying to sort of eke out a structure here. So that was The Secret Doctrine and Helena Blavatsky. And now we're going to get into what Rudolf Steiner has said about the influence of Venus in the earlier phases of the Earth in the Lemurian epoch. Now, Rudolf Steiner creates, I would say, much more of a structure in regards to the spiritual hierarchies and the spheres. And he actually relates to the angels of Venus, the word spirits of personality. So Rudolf Steiner will call angels something different depending on how you're entering into the conversation, right? So in the Lemurian epoch, we receive these angels from Venus. And these angels from Venus are what we would traditionally know as the gods, again, that walked amongst us. And they would also be called the spirits of personality, or I think sometimes he also relates them to time as well. And they're also the archai. And so they basically descend to the earth, right? Through, I would say they descend to the earth through the center of Venus, obviously, into the center of the earth, and then are on the earth, right? They have to go through that transubstantiation through the center of their planet as well, the center of ours. They come out through the sun at the center of the earth, and they basically enter into the earthly plane. Now, they're not walking around like physical human beings. They're not arriving in like a spaceship or anything like that. They're basically materializing here, and they enmesh with a human being. So they perceive a human being that is ready. And when a human being is basically at a point where they are becoming more and more highly developed, then you will receive the enmeshment with an angel or an archangel, and you'll begin to be uplifted. And that's where you become an adept and a higher and higher spiritual student and master, is basically through the enmeshment with these higher beings and the changes that happen to you when you're basically merging your consciousness with theirs. That's how we're designed, right? So in this way, you know, Rudolf Steiner is not talking about like ancient aliens. He's literally talking about spiritual entities that overlap or enmesh with humanity, okay? And this is during the Lemurian period. And now, this is I want to just give you the lecture title. So this is from the Spiritual Hierarchies lecture series, which is phenomenal and incredible. And this is lecture 7, okay? And he says, "And now something very remarkable happened upon the earth. Those men of Lemuria who had only physical, etheric, and astral bodies were helpless. They could not help themselves. They did not know what they had to do on earth. From heavenly regions, the inhabitants of astronomical Venus first came down to the earth, to these helpless beings, because they had a certain relationship to the physical body. They were enabled to send their light through. So there's a certain relationship between the earth and Venus, in that Venus provided the template of earthly life and of the perfected human body. So it's from Venus that Earth receives a certain template of life. And that's why they were also able to enter it here, right? It's because the Venusian sphere, that angelic plane, it essentially provided it to the earth to begin with. And so they were able to enter into human forms or merge with human beings and influence it, because they were kind of, from that perspective, from the angelic perspective, they're just kind of like going into a kind of like earlier version of their own development, or like a lower, denser version of their own development in a different time, technically, with slightly different forces involved. So that's why they were able to perceive it. That's why they were able to enter into it, is because they were coming from the plane of existence, the heavenly realm that basically provided the archetypal forces to create the earth to begin with. Okay. So I'll read that last question. Venus, beings from the astronomical Venus came down to the earth, to these helpless beings, because they had a certain relationship to the physical body. They were enabled to send their light through and ensoul the physical body of the first inhabitants of the earth. So we see here that when we're talking about relationships to the gods, right, of the past, it's really angels, and it's really a matter of ensoulment or soul enmeshment. It's not like a bunch of aliens are coming down and are like lording over you, right? So I want to be very clear about that in the Lemurian age, just so we all know, because there's so many stories that I see about people saying that these like people from Venus are coming in ships, and the people from Venus, the Nordic aliens from Venus, and that whole ideology, which I cover in The Dark Side of Disclosure, like Val Thor, things like this, that is just a literalist take on basically Rudolf Steiner's Angels of Venus. It's a literalist take on Helena Blavatsky's Lords of the Flame, Sunat Kumara. It is a materialist, literal take that is incorrect on already existing anthroposophical and theosophical concepts within spiritual science that are describing angels and their enmeshment with human beings on the earth. And why I make such a big deal out of this is because that is basically describing the human initiation process. So how you become an initiate, again, how you become a master, how you become an adept, is you basically have to enmesh with angels. And they work upon you, right? And your whole mind changes, your whole life changes in their image as you give yourself up to them. These are not demons, these are angelic beings, and they work with you. And so if you're thinking that that angelic being is like a physical thing that's flying around in a ship, you are effectively cut off from your own process of initiation, which is a really big deal, because you're not going to be able to conceptualize properly how you evolve, because our ancient past and initiation is not being taught properly. It's being taught too literalistically, too materialistically. Okay. So thus we find some among the Lemurians who passed among the mass of humanity in quite a remarkable way. They had a different physical body to the others. A man so particularly graced had not an ordinary physical body, but a body ensouled by a spirit of Venus. So he's not saying that these were like a different race of people, or talking about how like the physical body was like a different race or something. He's talking about that the physical body was technically different because it was ensouled and enmeshed with a spirit of Venus that had united with this person and was now working with them from within their own being. This is like the idea of your higher self or your guardian angel, that kind of thing. This is what we're looking at. So he was ensouled by a spirit of Venus, a spirit of personality, because that man of ancient Lemuria moved about with a spirit of Venus within his physical body. He had a powerful influence on all his surroundings. Such Lemurians did not appear different from their companions externally, but because a spirit of personality was translated into their bodies, these selected individuals acted suggestively, in the highest sense of the word, upon their surroundings. So they had these great powers. They were able to manifest things, move things, because the spirit was within them. This angel was working within their body. Today, there is nothing to compare to the obedience and reverence and awe that was felt for them. Now, this is an act of service, right? This is not like I have this spirit inside of me to lord over you and you know, be corrupt and take all your money and lord. No, that's satanic stuff. This is literally an act of service in which these spirits of personality or these angels of Venus would have to actually sacrifice something of their own nature to actually exist on the earth. So it's actually a massive sacrifice that they did. And it wasn't about control at all. Okay, that's fallen angel stuff. All right, so that's Rudolf Steiner. And again, that is from the Spiritual Hierarchies, Lecture 7. And in Lecture 7 and 8, in the Spiritual Hierarchies, he describes Atlantis, he describes Lemuria, and the different angels of Venus and then Mercury that basically work upon humanity. And that is the key to understanding life in other planes, in my opinion. Now, Pythagoras also talked about Venus as the soul altar or the second sun, and a little bit more on why Venus radiated so much was because it was, the inhabitants of Venus are essentially like a few steps ahead of us. And Venus is already becoming a star. So we talked about how the moment that Christ receives the earth, right, the moment that the blood of Christ enters the earth, then it begins to flip into becoming a star and produce its own unique light. Because again, remember, light is not all the same from the perspective of the highest spiritual planes, right? The light of Lucifer is recapitulated light. It's old light. You know, in order for the earth to become a true star, a true sun, it needs to create its own. So it uses the initiations from the Venusian waves, including that of Lucifer, but it must eventually produce its own light, its own energy, its own radiance. And we do that through building the glorified etheric body, through producing Buddhi, life spirit, Atman. That whole process in Anthroposophy is describing the human being producing something new, essentially. And what we will radiate at the end, hopefully, is love and compassion and freedom. That's what our radiance will ultimately be, if you were to look at it as a quality. Okay. So the idea that Venus is being called the soul altar or the second sun by Pythagoras is actually pretty significant, because it's saying that Venus is basically radiant. It is already ahead of the earth in its development. It has already received the Christ being, right, for its cycle, and it's already, you know, several cycles ahead of us. And that is getting into why the Venus mysteries are important, because once you get to the level of Venus in planetary and human development, certain things are required to get to the next phase, which it gets to the idea of sacrifice. So that is Pythagoras, and him calling the sun a soul altar was really hinting that he knew something a little bit more, perhaps. I mean, obviously, Venus is very bright. You know, it's the morning and evening star. But to call it a second sun also is revealing a very deep secret about Lemuria and early humanity and our relationship with Venus and also about Jesus, about the Christ, about initiation, right? You know, there's so many secrets that lie in understanding Venus and understanding the Earth's overall development as a whole from epoch to epoch to epoch. Because it's only in that process that we can see our own growth and initiation over time. So there's also a really interesting Eastern take on this. And the book is a little bit obscure, but I've mentioned it several different times when I was doing my lecture series called the Creation Series. The last 3 or 4 lectures in the Creation Series are about Venus and the fall of the angels from Venus, the connection to Mercury, the rise of a new angelic class, the evolution of humanity through Lemurian Atlantis. So that's the Creation Series if you're interested. And I did use some work from this text in that, so you may recognize it. So this text is called Venus, the Key to Immortality. So obviously the key to immortality in Venus is that the resurrection. So when I started to receive the Venus mysteries years ago, my guides would not call it the glorified body or resurrection body. They just called it the Venus body, that must be developed. And they would speak to me in planetary terms. And so Venus, the key to immortality, is basically Venus, the key to the immortal body, because that is the image in which we build in which we will one day evolve into Venus. Earth will one day rise to the point of being like Venus, and at that point we will be immortal too. So that's there's a lot of deep wisdom actually in this one. So this is by Kumar, Kumar, and again the book is called Venus, the Key to Immortality, and this is what he says about Venus and Venus's relationship to the Earth. The planet Venus is the higher aspect of our Earth. It functions as our higher counterpart. Venus directs its energy towards the Earth to raise the Earth into sublime states. This is why it is called the elder sister or elder brother of our Earth. And its link to our Earth is in the North Pole. So the North, I have to just interject here. The poles, the North and South poles, are also typically associated with linking to different planetary spheres. And so when you see all these people that are like, I'm going to Antarctica, I'm going to, the poles, are you going there to get your bacteria samples, or are you actually going there because there is an esoteric direct overlap with Mars and with Venus and certain magical practices that can occur at the poles? Around the North Pole of the Earth, there is the Venusian energy linking up. The ones who carry the Venusian energy keep guiding the Earth and the beings on the Earth. The vibrations of the matter being relating to Venus is much more subtler. So that the substrate that Venus is made out of is much more subtle, but it forms the first and second ether of our Earth. The beings that visit our Earth from Venus permeate in the ether of our Earth, so they live within the orbit between Earth and Venus, and they permeate that of Earth. It is for that reason it is said that the logos and ruler of our planet is Sunat, Kumara. So this is part of the Eastern teachings of Venus. Is logos and ruler of our planet, Sunat Kumara, is the second ether of our Earth. He cannot descend further. He is a descendant of Venus. So it goes on and on about Sunat Kumara, because when we get into the idea of Sunat Kumara, we're getting into the idea of a planetary regent or the Lord of the Earth, or a certain level of human initiation where you can get so high in your development that you can actually give your own soul, your own substrate to a planetary sphere in order for it to develop. It's a very high level of development that's hard to fathom, but you can get to a level of initiation as a soul where you can become a planetary regent, right? So that's what's happening when they talk about sometimes Lucifer or Sunat, Kumar, these different beings that appear. And also, you can also look at this in even a smaller way in the anthroposophical stream, where Rudolf Steiner talks about like the folk spirits and the archangels and how they will sort of take on an entire, they'll sort of sacrifice themselves and renounce their own development in their own planetary development. They'll renounce that, their own ability to graduate into a higher plane. They'll renounce that and they'll offer themselves to a developing world in different capacities. So the idea of a planetary regent, or you have these great beings that sacrifice a part of themselves for humanity, like the Christ being, right? These are the sacrificial acts that make you a great initiate, essentially. So, and they're required to get into further levels of initiation. It's not required, but there's a certain path that is the path of renunciation. And the path of renunciation in the mysteries is when certain initiates get higher and higher, you have the ability to basically move on into higher planes with your consciousness. You don't have to incarnate anymore. You can kind of help from afar, like with your thoughts and things like that. But you work in a different way. But then there's a path of renunciation where you can be an angel or various degrees of angels, archangel, archai, going all the way up. And you could have an opportunity to rise and basically not have to be at your level anymore, but instead you renounce that. And in that renunciation, you actually offer part of your own substrate to humanity, which for them will be extremely advanced, right? Because your level's higher than earthly development as an angel, or well, mainly archangel or archai. And that becomes the substrate for humanity to develop, or even for a planet to develop. So this is all about, again, the human initiation process and how it relates to even the creation of worlds at some levels, or the destruction of worlds with fallen angels that are, fallen angels aren't renunciating anything. They're not renouncing anything. They're just, it's the opposite. But anyway, so that when you start getting into like the story of like the Lord of the World, or this idea of planetary regents, or even in Rudolf Steiner's lectures on the folk souls, he has a phenomenal lecture series called The Mission of Folk Souls. And near the end of that lecture series, he talks about renunciation and how these great beings in the cosmos and the spiritual hierarchies would renounce their own development and through that renunciation sacrifice a part of themselves, and that would go into the development of humanity, and that would create new organs for humanity. It would create an impulse, and of course the biggest example of this is Christ incarnating in Jesus and then renouncing basically his own life and existence, and that creates a substrate of the new etheric plane of the earth, right, through the Christ being. So renunciation is a big part of this. Understanding renunciation is a very big part of understanding a certain level of initiation and the spiritual hierarchies. Okay, so that actually concludes our lecture for today. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to read a conclusion here, but before I get into that and really close this out, I want to remind you that I will be heading over to my private platform and I will be taking questions from my members. I do live Q&As there basically every second Sunday. I try to do something here on YouTube and Rumble and Facebook every other week, usually Thursday or Sunday. But I'm over there, and we do every second Sunday, we go for 3-4 hours sometimes. And I just take your questions, whatever you want to talk about. We get into politics sometimes, we get into Anthroposophy, Theosophy, all kinds of spiritual topics, everything in between. And so if you enjoy my work, I'd love to see you over there. And if you have a question, absolutely sign up so you can get your question in as well. I'll be over there probably for like another hour and a half, I'd say, just getting into any questions you have about Black Sun, Christ and the transformation to white sun energy, Venus, anything you want to know today about that, head over there and I'll see you over there in probably about 5 minutes. All right, so let's conclude our lecture today. At the center of the earth is a solar point, a vortex point that leads into higher planes. In the first half of earthly evolution, it was more of a black sun, creating a period of involution and recapitulation. After the incarnation of Christ, it turns into a white sun force, creating evolution. Here, something new is created. So in order for it to be a true star, a true white sun force, again, not just any light will do. It has to be something new has to be created. And this is true actually with building favor in the astral plane. So when you think about, like, say there are two magicians battling, and one is a dark magician and one is a light magician. Now, the reason why the light magician will always win and eventually the dark magician will always lose is because the white magician will always be creating something new in the truest sense of these magical paths. So when something new is produced, then the beings in the astral planes rejoice. They are fed, they are nourished, and they send something down in return. Something new can only be produced through the impulse of Christ. So we can only create something new through the impulse of Christ, of God within our being. Nothing new can be created unless we are unified with that force, right? So the whole thing about true black magic, true dark entities, true dark people, dark spirits, dark magicians in the true sense of the word, is because they don't work with Christ. They're limited to working with the energies of the old ways. They're limited to using the false light, to recycled light, and rearranging that in sacrifices, and constantly trying to rearrange that in these different ways to manipulate things through very small bursts of energy, through sacrifices and things like that. But nothing new is created. It's just the rearranging of all of this old energy. And really, it's a kind of cannibalism, right? And there's a period of development where you can't really tell that it is, but eventually it becomes very obvious that black magic is nothing more than cannibalism, self-cannibalism, and to cannibalize the planet. So in order to be truly powerful, you have to unite with the Christ force, right? And that is when something new is created or brought forth into this world, right? And that is what builds favor in the higher planes. All right. And that is what builds power in the individual. That's what evolution is. Evolution is uniting with the Christ force within you and ultimately transubstantiating yourself, right? But it is also the creation of something new, which is a particular kind of radiance from the solar plane or the highest heavenly plane. There's a difference between the light of something that's created with Christ, that's new, and the dying light of Lucifer, the dying light of the old world, the old way that was just regurgitated from the Venusian plane to the earth and keeps being recycled. So it's very important that we know the difference between the Luciferic impulse and its high time in Lemuria and early initiating, and the difference between Christ and the light ether that is produced through the Christ impulse. These aren't just random figures that are to fit into whatever we think. This is the objective reality of earthly evolution. Okay? So after the incarnation of Christ, the earth begins to turn into a sun. Okay, it begins to turn into a star. And there's a phenomenal book series by Sergei Prokofiev. I think it's Prokofiev. I'm sorry if I'm saying that name wrong, but I think it's Prokofiev, and it's his Resurrection series. And the last book, which is huge, but it's amazing, is he says, and the earth becomes a sun, and it's beautiful. And I can't recommend that book enough, because that is when if we can understand that, we're really going to be preparing ourselves and conditioning ourselves to understand our world properly, right? We're able to put these forces in their right place in our life. So before the earth was able to receive Christ, because the earth was not able to receive Christ until about midway through its development. Humanity was not able to receive Christ. They didn't have their eye. We were just like little babies. And a planet can only receive Christ at a certain time. Until then, there has to be a planetary sphere that kind of stands in and will basically translate the energy of the sun and the beings in the sun, the Christ in the sun, and it'll kind of digest it and then almost like give it to the planet, to us. So we needed that planet to be a stand-in until we were ready to receive the Christ and evolve with it, with the solar force into higher planes. That planet is Venus. Okay, that's why you hear Blavatsky saying Venus is the most powerful planet, and that's also why this is the thing too in occult science, is that like some individuals get very caught up in the reality that Venus was the informing sphere for the planet in the earlier developmental phase. But it's like you can take it's like, because that happened, they stay in that level of Venus worship, right? Which is also a kind of black sun worship, or it's a certain kind of it's a certain kind of cosmology. So if you are not acknowledging what the Christ impulse is, what the Christ being is, what that event was, then you're kind of just still existing in the pre-Christ paradigm, which is objectively incorrect, because the earth is in a completely different cycle now. And so sometimes in esoteric, you'll see that division of individuals that are out of time. They're operating as though it's thousands of years ago in a system that hasn't been correct for 2,000 years now. So understanding that Christ energy is the alchemical point in which we transform ourselves is everything in our time. It doesn't mean that we should look badly upon any systems pre-Christ or anything like that, but we just have to understand the significance of it and the difference, right? And how a lot of those earlier periods were really preparing for the Christ impulse, when something new could be created on the earth through humanity, and we could truly take our station as angels. Okay, the intermediary between the earth and the heavens was Venus, until the incarnation of Christ, in which the earth operates differently as it directly interacts with the solar force. So after the incarnation of Christ, the earth is like directly interfacing and connected with the Christ being and the solar force. And so Venus takes a different role. It wouldn't be correct now to say that Venus is initiating the planet and Venus is doing all this stuff, because it takes a different role now that we've had the incarnation of Christ, right? So that's the difference there. All right, you guys, it was my absolute pleasure to be with you today. And if you want to join me, I will be going over to my members only site and to take your questions. If not, I will probably be right back here on YouTube, Rumble, and Facebook in not next week, but the week after. I'll probably do a live stream or I have some more lectures planned for you as well. I'm probably going to be doing obviously more lectures in this Venus series. So if you want to go more into the feminine mysteries with me, I would love that. We're going to get more into Venus. So yeah, it was my pleasure to connect today, and I'm going to leave you and head over to my other site. Thank you. Hi, guys. So thank you for joining me over here on our community, on our platform. I hope you have been writing out any questions you have for this lecture about